She is an associate editor with the Journal of Business Research and Journal of Strategic Marketing. She is also on the advisory board of some top-tier journals. Now, I would like to invite Professor Shefali Gupta to introduce our guest for the session.
Thank you, Vishali, for initiating the session. So today, welcome everyone on this talk series. Today we have Professor Kelly Hewett with us. As Vishali has already mentioned, Professor Kelly is a Reagan Professor of Marketing at Haslam College of Business, University of Tennessee. She is also an editor-in-chief of Journal of International Marketing, which is an AMA official journal. And before academia, she has been associated with Bank of America as a senior vice president. Professor Kelly is also on the advisory board of CREM, and we are quite fortunate to have her around. Her research is being published in the top-tier academic journal, including many UT Dallas and FT50, such as Journal of Marketing, Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of Retailing, Journal of Management Studies, Journal of Academy of Marketing Science. She specializes in marketing strategy and has received many awards and recognition for her research and teaching. I'm sure today's session gonna be pretty engaging and insightful for everyone. Now over to you, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Shefali, and thank you for all of you who are hoping to get something out of my talk today. I'm honored to be the second presenter and to follow Werner Reinertz, who's a very well-recognized and amazing scholar. And I will mention that I have been to MICA several years ago for the AIM, Academy of Indian Marketing Chef Consortium. So I've had the pleasure of visiting your campus. So it's for that reason also I'm excited to be talking with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I'm sharing with you today is actually a research paper, but I'm happy to, pause whenever there are questions and something raises some thoughts that you'd like to share. This is a paper I'm working on with Mike Salukian. He's a former doctoral student here at the University of Tennessee. He just started his first academic year at the University of Missouri. And also Harold Van Heerde from University of New South Wales and Bill Rand from NC State University. Some of you might have seen their names. They're two of my favorite co-authors. And this project, we're very fortunate to have just received a second revision at the Journal of Marketing Research. So because this paper is in the review process at this time, I thought it might be interesting to, in the talk, actually take you through the progression of this project. So I will actually start before we launch this project and go back to in 2016, I published a Journal of Marketing article with Bill and Harold, but also with Roland Rust, titled Brand Buzz in the Ecoverse. And this was motivated by my experience at Bank of America, where during the financial crisis, which is the period in which I was working at the bank, we moved from being one of the most reputable and credible brands in the world to sort of falling into that kind of big bank bashing, and it became kind of a hated brand. And so the impetus for that was obviously, the traditional media and the social media was just starting to take off at that time. And so we've hypothesized and found support for this, this echo chamber type structure in the brand communications environment. And so Bill and I, after this paper was published, we decided we really wanted to go much deeper on how the firm can control this communications ecoverse. And in a customer-centric focus, we decided to look at the conversations that brands are having in social media directly with users or consumers. And so those paths that you see highlighted are really the focus of this paper that I'm going to be presenting today. And so we showed in this paper at an aggregate level, if we look on a daily basis, aggregated to a daily basis, what levers firms have to actually get control of these various paths. And we found that when the firm uses social media, both the volume and the tone of those posts from the firm can dampen negative word of mouth and basically take fuel out of the fire. And so that's the beginning of the process for this current paper that I'm sharing with you. So let me give you a little bit of an idea of the context. So we look at conversations on Twitter between brands and individuals and how those conversations evolve over time and how firms can actually change the direction of those conversations to a place where they're more favorable for the brand. So in this example, this is one from Wells Fargo. A user named Michelle says, why would you try to solicit me with a credit card offer while I'm in the drive-thru? I don't know if that's ever happened to anybody, but this person, this is a negative comment. And then we see after that, another user chime in to the conversation. And then at that point, the firm replies to the initial person and says, we'll be sure to share your feedback appropriately. And then we can kind of follow this conversation. So it goes from I wouldn't say angry tone, but a decidedly negative tone in the initial tweet to eventually a more positive tone. And we see that the company, Wells Fargo, has chimed in 2 times. And we see the tone change after each of those interventions by the firm. So this is the context. We want to see, based on what's happening in a conversation, so not the firm initiating it, based on what's already happening in a conversation in social media, what are the things that firms can do to move those conversations in such a positive direction? So let me give you a little more context to understand the exact questions that we set out to answer. So we specifically look at tone of the conversation in terms of both valence, is it positive or negative, but also arousal, is it heated or very excited? And we wanted, obviously, if we're a brand, we would like to see conversations end up in this upper right quadrant where they're both positive and excited. That would be sort of the best situation. And so I have to give credit to Mike for the baby pictures. So we have a very excited baby. All right. So we named these quadrants in this way. These are our labels. These aren't anything directly from the literature. These were our labels. So we call the conversations that are in this upper right quadrant of this 2x2 excited conversations or narratives. And Mike claims that baby looks suspiciously like me. I'll let you decide. This is not an actual baby picture of me, but and then we also have satisfied, which are positive but not particularly excited. And then we have, in terms of negative tone, we have low arousal negative conversations, which we've labeled sad. And then we also have angry ones. So as a brand, let's say you enter a conversation and it's in this lower left quadrant, which we've labeled sad. And if you've ever met Bill Rand, Mike says this baby looks suspiciously like Bill Rand. You're getting the theme here. So we would, if we're a brand, love to be able to move a sad conversation, which is kind of like the Wells Fargo one that I just shared with you, to an excited place. But that might be more difficult than moving that sad conversation to at least a satisfied place. And in this baby, Mike claims looks suspiciously like Harold. So again, you get the theme. One of the things the firm does not want to do is move that conversation to an angry place. And Mike says that's baby Mike. So let's look at this same kind of dynamic over time, and you'll really get a feel for this paper and how it's structured. So we look at a given conversation, the firm enters, and let's say it's in a negative place, and that's angry. So high arousal and low valence. And then we see the firm intervenes, and we're looking at these 4 particular levers. So whether the firm's own content is positive or negative, valence, high or low arousal, and then also subjective versus objective. And that means whether they're providing factual information or using a more subjective tone, like I think or something along those lines. And then the lever we examine is whether or not the firm stays on the same topic that is being addressed in that conversation or tries to change the topic of the conversation. And we use a theory called speech act theory to propose these. And just for the sake of getting to the current version of the paper, really focusing on what we found in the study and how we structured the data. So in this example on the right-hand side, we see this conversation starts in an angry place, the firm intervenes, and then that immediately tones down the arousal. And we see valence start to climb, but it's still in a low place. So that conversation has moved from angry to sad. And then we see the firm intervene again. Let's just assume that those 4 levers are here. And that firm intervention is able to further dampen arousal, but also lift valence. And then we see the firm chime in again, and we eventually see that conversation go to an excited place. So this is exactly what we're trying to understand. So just imagine the world of Twitter, how messy tweets are. We had to figure out how we could actually model a conversation to study it, to actually put it into an empirical model to test the effectiveness of these levers. So this is the way we constructed the database. I'm going to tell you a little more about the data in just a moment. But in order to be considered a conversation for our purposes, we, number one, had to have a conversation where a user, at least one user, had already said something. The firm then is making a decision to chime into that conversation. So then we have to have an instance of the firm chiming in, and then we have to have a subsequent response from someone else in order to see whether what the firm did works. So you see this box highlighting the elements that are tested in our model. And specifically, if we look at this in a little more granular way, we look at, in the current conversation up to the point before the firm intervenes, this first UGC box that's highlighted. So before the firm intervention. And then as our outcome, we want to see what happens afterward. And then as our firm levers, which we model as interaction or moderators of this direct path, we look at the valence, arousal, subjectivity, and topic similarity. So how do we do this over the entire conversation? So this UGC is, we've done this numerous ways in the paper, but it is the average of the user conversation valence and the user conversation arousal up to this point. So that antecedent is taking into consideration the entire conversation up to the point the firm intervenes. So it's fairly sticky. So we really have to have a big effect to see if it has an impact. This was simply so we had a way of testing these relationships. And you'll see that we've made some changes as we've moved forward. Then we also wanted to see so the question we're answering is, what is the impact of firm intervention on the course of conversation? But we also wanted some external evidence that this matters. So if we can move that conversation to a positive place, what else can we show in terms of possible positive impacts for the brand? And so to do that, we were able to access data on brand sentiment through the YouGov. This is a UK firm that does polling about thousands of brands every day. And we were able to get the brand buzz metric, which is a measure of how positive or negative the buzz in the media about a brand are based on people's perceptions. So it's a survey. They ask people, have you heard anything positive or negative about a brand? And that's what this is capturing, like the net positivity of buzz about the brand. And this can only be measured at the daily level. So we had to then run a separate model where we aggregated that subsequent UGC. All right, I hope that was relatively clear for you. Let's talk a little bit more about the data and what we found. So our data, given my background in banking, and because we're building on that Ecoverse paper, we also set this study in the banking context. And so we have every tweet to or from the 4 largest US banks over a 10-year period. So these are the 4 banks: Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, and JP Morgan Chase. And we had to do a lot of cleaning. So we took out retweets and things that were nonsensical. And we ended up with about 1.6 million tweets. We also had to make sure that the tweets that we kept, or the conversations that we kept, I should say, allowed us to test that model. So that means if a firm tweeted and then no one answered, that's not useful for us. And even if a user tweeted to the firm and then nothing ever else happened, that's not useful to us. So after removing those conversations that did not allow us to test our model, we moved from around 390,000 threads, which would be any combination, to just over 200,000 conversations. Okay, so a little more about that, how we process those data. I'm not going to go into detail here. This was Mike and Bill's specialization. And so for the valence and arousal metrics, we use a dictionary called ANU. And subjectivity, we use this LSTM approach. And for topic similarity, we looked at the cosine similarity across all the topics. We did topic modeling. We found 14 topics that were addressed in these tweets. And then we looked at this vector of topics across the firm and the prior user sentiment, okay? The prior user tweets. So the model that we ran, started out looking at main effects. We didn't really have a particular hypothesis about main effects, but it makes sense that if you're already positive in tone or negative in tone, that the users would stay similar in tone on average, and the same with arousal. But our main interest is in these moderators. So this is a bit hard to explain in terms of managerial implications just by looking at coefficients. So I'm going to show you in a moment a simulation or a scenario kind of dashboard that we put together to help us understand these effects. But we see that subjectivity, let's say, for example, that the valence is negative in a conversation when we enter it, then the subsequent would be on average negative. And then we see that tweet valence from the firm will lift that, attenuate it. Firm tweet arousal will also lift that. And then subjectivity can dampen it. It can reduce it. And similarity, staying on topic, is a positive interaction. And then the same with arousal. We can see positive carryover to next arousal, negative relationship between valence and arousal. And then we see significant interaction effects for each of the firm levers on the arousal and the outcome in the subsequent tweets. We also found in a separate model, we had to aggregate to the daily level, that brand buzz is significantly impacted by daily valence and arousal of tweets. So what does all this mean? So again, it's hard to really tell a manager, well, if you move this by X, it's just hard to explain. So we decided to run a scenario where what we did was we took the effects of the model that you just saw, and we looked at if the firm enters in each of these quadrants using each of those levers, what is the impact on subsequent UGC? And then we put that in the brand buzz model. And so we can tell you what is going to do the best job at lifting brand buzz based on where you are in the conversation when the firm enters. So let me explain how this looked. So in this SAD quadrant, what we're showing here is we took the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile values of each of these four levers, and we looked at the impact on UGC and then on brand buzz subsequent to that. And for each quadrant, we looked at which is the best level that gives you the lift in brand buzz. Should you be low in each of these, middle of each of these, or high? And then we also looked at the priority, which one has the strongest effect. And so we have the priority in parentheses. So in this particular case, the most important thing you can do is be subjective. Don't use factual language with consumers in social media when they're in this negative place, a sad conversation. And you should be highly subjective, okay? The second thing is to that arousal, your arousal level is very important. It's the second most important thing. But in the case of arousal, you should be low in arousal. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and put the others, populate the other cells so you can see how this changes across the cells. So look where the sad narrative was, and then compare that, for example, to the excited narrative. And in the excited case, when you're entering an excited conversation, subjectivity becomes the least important thing you can do. You need to be low, so that differs, but also the priority differs. The most important thing in that case is to stay positive and highly aroused. So be excited yourself in the tone of what you're saying with users in social media. And then we can also see difference with angry. That's probably the case that you really want to calm things down. And in this case, staying on topic is the number one thing you should do. If someone's angry and they're saying, the teller ate my ATM ate my debit card, somebody's really angry. First thing you need to do is acknowledge what that customer is saying, what that user is saying. Do not change the subject and start trying to, assuage their anger. And then arousal in that case is the least important thing. However, it should be high. So you should match arousal in that case still. Don't try to calm them down immediately. Acknowledge what they're saying. So in summary, what we believe this simulation, this scenario analysis is telling us is listed on the left. So 1, do not respond to unhappy customers with facts. Use subjective language. Don't try to convince them with factual information. Our teller hours are X. That's not going to make them feel better. Second, do not change the topic when someone is angry. Do not. Okay.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure.
Yeah. So, like with the first quadrant, low side, and like I'm talking about the sad narrative versus the angry narrative, right? And if you look at the priority of the topic similarity, it is completely opposite.
Correct.
So if we look at the angry versus sad, how do you narrate or define the sad and angry? Angry is all top of the notch kind of thing, and the sad is the T-1 kind of thing. It is like they have settled down with their anger, but they are kind of sad. It is a past moment. It's a T-1 probably. Like
so you're thinking that it could be that the conversation starts in Q4 and then moves to Q3. Yeah, that can absolutely happen. And that's still better. Q3 is still better than Q4 for the brand. But then how you respond after you enter.
Why this completely striking like difference between the topic similarity between these two?
So I can't speak to kind of underlying things because we weren't able to test for them. But one way to think about it is when someone's angry, they're probably seeking a solution to something, a problem, something that's gone really wrong, which is different than say, I just don't like something you just did. So take why would you solicit me for a credit card offer? It's not like somehow they've been charged a big fee for something, or they haven't been able to access their funds or something like that, which would fuel an angry tone. So my kind of lay suspicion about that difference is that most angry narratives really represent some underlying problem that needs to be solved, and sad ones may not. And so that would lead topic similarity to be the highest possible priority, because that is something that is in the moment a customer or a user needs to be resolved, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
good question. And obviously we would love to know what's going on underneath some of these, but and you'll see when I get to the current version, they've asked us to do some surveys. So maybe we'll get a little bit more insight into some of this, but this framework has changed quite a bit with the review process, which you'll see in just a moment. But thank you for the question.
Look at different segments, right? You took tweets at the corporate level, right? For instance, Wells Fargo and all that, they have different divisions, and I will expect the consumer division, wealth management division to have different kind of interface with the customer service than the commercial division. Commercial division will very rarely get angry and very rarely get excited, because there are different individuals operating it. Do you agree or do you disagree?
Yes, I do agree. So first, to answer your question, this is an aggregate. I mean, this is, you saw like 1.5, 1.6 million tweets. So it's really just looking at every interaction. And to your point, sometimes these divisions have different handles in social media. So on Twitter, for example, let's just take Bank of America. They might have Bank of America brand, kind of what they call enterprise brand account. Then they might have a specific account for customer service. So for that one, it's B of A Help. They might have a separate one for wealth management and a separate one for the commercial side. So we look at all of them. Our data represent every handle that a firm owns. And we even we scraped for if the CEO is tweeting, then that's captured for each of these firms. And we even looked for, because sometimes people won't address something to the firm, they might put it in a hashtag. And so we also looked for hashtags either mentioning the companies or some of their brands, like, Chase Blue Sapphire credit card, because somebody might tweet, my Chase Blue Sapphire credit card, just my payment didn't go through or something like that. So this does represent the full scope of every account. And it's hard for a database this size and a model with this complexity to use individual level kind of fixed effects. We did use firm level, but that's a really good point. And we actually have that opportunity to look at the specific account that the firm used in its response. And we probably have enough degrees of freedom to use those as fixed effects. So I like that idea. I'm going to write that down, because we could indeed see that these relationships differ, whether it is more of a wealth client or an individual, like you or I using our credit card. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. I'm going to write that down. Thank you for the idea. Again, this is still in the review process, so this is perfect to be able to get these ideas. So fixed effects by account. Thank you. So unfortunately, the review team came back with a lot of things they wanted us to change. So the first thing I'm going to do before I get into the next version is just share with you kind of high level what the reviewers said. So first, they really pushed back on our use of Speech Act theory. And so we, as a team, looked at the variables, the levers we were examining, and others that were in our model, but more as controls or in our control functions for endogeneity tests, et cetera. And one thing that really stood out to us is that they, as a whole, were reflective of this concept of empathy, which has started to find its way into our literature. So we looked to the counseling psychology literature, we looked to literature and empathy across many disciplines. And some of the consistent things we found were that, using empathetic language is really important, staying on topic. So when someone is upset and you're counseling them, for example, one of the first rules is to acknowledge what that person is upset about, what you're counseling them about. So staying on topic, that's part of empathy. Also matching their sentiment. If they're upset, don't, grin and smile and try to force them to change their tone based on your happy tone. So mirroring both the topic and the sentiment is supported in the counseling literature. And then moving conversations to one-on-one, where you're being very individual in your approach. And so the way we have chose to proxy for that is, and this does come up in the data quite frequently, where someone responding from a firm will say, direct message me so I can get, your information. And so it on the one hand, we thought, well, direct messaging might be seen as trying to, take something from public to private to kind of, hide things. But on the other hand, there was a lot of support for this idea of moving it to one-on-one, where you're not talking to the Twitter world, but also in a lot of cases, especially with banks, you have to share private information in order to actually get something resolved if it is indeed a problem. So you might need account numbers or things that really can't be addressed in a Twitter feed, in a public arena. So we argued that taking a conversation to this one-on-one place and allowing the full information to be shared so that something can actually be addressed is reflective of an empathetic approach. You're really trying to resolve if there is an issue. And then the final thing that we included was sometimes people who are responding for the firm will use their proper name. They'll, I would have signed, Kelly. And to us, that is an indication of kind of openness and moving to more of this one-on-one. It's not the firm and the customer talking or the user talking, it's this individual talking with them. So we reframed our theory as reflecting empathy. And then in terms of model and data, they pushed back on us eliminating a lot of these types of conversations before we even started. And I'll share with you how we addressed that. And they didn't like us separating the tone into both valence and arousal. They said it's not new. Berger and Milkman, seminal article in marketing on the importance of both valence and arousal. They said just make the model less complicated on the DV side and get richer on the other parts of the model. So we did. They pushed back on, we had to account for selection, firms choosing to enter a particular conversation. We also had to account for endogeneity. So in our instrumental variables that were important as part of those checks, they pushed back on specific instrumental variables. So for example, we had argued that the volume of tweets that the firm is putting out in a given day would impact their likelihood of responding. They might have workload issues. And I think rightly so, we were pushed to think about it as unexpected, where they didn't have staff. And so we moved that to if it was outside of 3 standard deviations from a normal, typical day over the past month. And so we changed our instrumental variables. We moved from having the customer service agent be because we argued that they might have their own style and tone. And the review process came back and said, well, firms themselves have training. And we didn't really find that in our data, but we decided to just listen to the reviewers. And so we shifted some of our instrumental variables, as you see. And then for positioning, they asked us to do some manager interviews and they wanted us to clarify a little bit more strongly how our study was differentiated. So again, just to kind of give you some insight into the review process, I'm going to show you a little bit more about how we captured these variables that we used, and then just get into our results. And then I'll conclude by telling you about the second revision we got just 3 weeks ago. So our 5 FGC, firm generated content variables, are as shown here. And this actually became an issue for us. We had to end up asking for 2 extensions on our revision because we had done all of the changes and rewritten the paper. But then a new paper from an author named Herrhausen came out in the Journal of Marketing, and it was about empathy. And that paper had a dictionary that they created. And so we felt like it would be expected that we replicated empathy using their dictionary, even though in our case, we felt like it wasn't the best way of capturing it. So that took us a lot more work. We had to rework all the model. Just to give you an idea of how the review process works. So sometimes you end up kind of having something come out in the literature that you then feel like you have to address. And so that caused us to have to ask for an extension. So that's language showing warmth, compassion, and concern, and then matching the topic conceptually, that's showing that you understand what they're going through, their thoughts and perspectives. From matching sentiment, there's a lot of literature on emotional contagion and the positive effects of that. And then for direct messaging, making an effort to connect directly with those participating, and then personal signature showing that an individual is emotionally involved in the interaction and signaling interpersonal concern. So those are our firm variables now. And in terms of the data, again, we had eliminated, this is showing you sort of how conversations happen in our data. So the type number 1, a user tweets, and then the firm never participates, but you might have many, 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 many individuals participating. Second type, the firm tweets, and then nobody else other than the firm. And that you can see the biggest is this just users talking. That's 1.6 million tweets. Then we have the user tweets, the firm tweets, and then there is no response. And then you have the firm tweeting first and the user, and then no response. So at first we were only interested in really number 5, 6, and number 7, but then we weren't using the first firm tweet. Now we use them all. So we use the ones in our selection models. We use the conversations where the firm chooses to enter or not, regardless. So we're using the entire scope of the data, right? So just to give you a glimpse of what the entire data set looks like. That's why I'm sharing this. And interestingly, just in case you're curious, so in this last row, we see the total number of tweets when it is a firm and users going back and forth. The maximum was over 3,600. So some of these conversations are quite long. The average is more like 3 point something. So most of them look like either firm user firm or user firm user, and that's it. Okay. So our model now looks like this. We still need UGC up to the time the firm intervenes, and then the UGC after, and then we now have these 5 components of FGC. Okay. I think I'll hold this. I can come back to it, but I want to make sure I leave some time for questions from the group. But I thought it would be interesting to show you how the data look based on an example. So here's an example of a conversation with Wells Fargo. The first tweet says, why did I go with Wells Fargo? Calling them is, you can read. Calling them is like calling the deepest bowels of hell, but just want to talk to a person. So this is unhappy. And then we see the firm intervene. So we can see that this is negative sentiment. They're not they are shouting, but it's not as negative as the next one. And then we see the coding for the FGC. So empathetic wording based on this response. Sorry to see this. Tell us the reason for your call. I'd like to assist you. So empathizing, they're at 13%. Sentiment matching, they're matching this. Sorry would be kind of keeping it in that tone. Direct messaging, they do not, and they do not sign their name. So this is how the data look once it's coded based on an example. Okay. And then they stay negative here. I'm just a bitter old person trapped in a young person's body or world. Just want to know if you have offer safe deposit boxes and how much they cost. So again, still negative. But then the firm intervenes again. We can see these data, more empathetic wording. Again, relatively high sentiment matching and topic matching, no DM, no agent signing. And then we see their final response. It's thank you. So, and then it becomes decidedly very positive. Okay, just a nice illustration. So the results of this model, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly show that these interactions are again significant. But again, we want to help you understand what they're saying. So we run a couple of scenario analyses to help us understand that. So on the left here, we're showing just the averages across the entire database. So typically people are tweeting when they're not that happy. If in the average in the negative preceding user sentiment case is about negative 0.5, neutral or about 0.008, very, very close to 0, and then high is around 0.455. But what we're really interested in is if I change one element of firm-generated content at the time, what is the possible impact on user sentiment in each of these cases? When you enter a negative conversation and use empathetic wording, how much can you lift the subsequent user sentiment in the next tweet? And so what we can see on aggregate across all of these is that the single firm-generated content characteristic that has the biggest potential lift is staying on topic across all conditions. It doesn't matter whether the conversation is negative, neutral, or positive. When you enter it, the number one thing that will lift user sentiment is topic matching. And we can see that It's most effective when you're entering a negative conversation, but it's still positive across all of them. And we can see the order shifts a little bit. The second most important thing is actually direct messaging. It has a significant positive lift in user sentiment and a bigger lift in user sentiment when the conversation is negative at the time you tell the user to tweet you directly. So we wanted to see a little bit more evidence to help firms understand what they're currently doing versus what they should be doing based on our modeling results. And so we're trying to show that in this set of graphs. So what we're showing here, we have the 5 graphs for each of the firm generated content elements. So topic matching, sentiment matching, agent signing, direct messaging, and empathetic wording. So what these graphs show you, these lines are showing you the observed level of topic matching for each of these conditions. And what the bars are showing you is the possible impact on user sentiment for using topic matching. And so as we see here, we observe this level, but if you were to use it, you have the potential to lift sentiment by a great deal. And here in the sentiment matching case is where we see the biggest potential. As we see, the observed level is close to 0, and that's because it's about matching. It's not saying that the firm is using negative sentiment, but it's matching. It's not really matching at all. And what's happening is even when someone is very negative in what they're saying, the firms are not going negative. They're actually tending to maintain positive sentiment in their tweets, which, I think that seems intuitive. Companies would never want to be negative themselves. But what this is showing is that if you tone it down, if you tone it down from being very, very, very positive, you have a significant chance of lifting user sentiment if you do. And so this is probably one of the most revealing cases where firms are really not taking the most efficient or most effective approach. And if they were to at least tone their messages down in this particular case in terms of their own sentiment, don't act very excited when you're responding to someone who's not, or someone who's upset, either sad or angry, you have a tremendous opportunity to repair sentiment in those tweets. So this idea of matching sentiment is very important. We also see a pretty big lift here with using empathetic language. They don't tend to use empathetic language across any of these conditions based on the dictionary we used. But if we look in all of them, but mostly in the positive current sentiment case, we see a significant opportunity to lift user sentiment. Okay. So in terms of customer centricity, I think this is a really good kind of roadmap for firms to focus on what is being said and adjust their responses. And we can put together sort of a dashboard for companies based on this in terms of how to actually lift that sentiment from users. All right, so that is the version that we submitted right around the beginning of the year. And we now have the feedback from the reviewers from round 2. And to be honest with you, I've kept this high level because we are just getting started. This just came back a couple of weeks ago. And so one of the things they said was now empathy is not new. We run into this because now there are at least 2 in our top tier journals, papers that are really heavily focused on empathy. This isn't new, and they push back on a couple of things like the direct message. They want more clarification on why that really reflects empathy and not just hiding things. And so, we might end up taking one of those out of the model just to is active listening, where empathy is sort of an element of active listening, where you are matching the topic, so you're actively listening. So now we're in the midst of doing the literature review to make sure we are accounting for that. Actually, we can account for that. We can actually support that as the framing. And we'll probably end up shifting a couple of the FGC elements in order to fit that term, active listening. So we're in this process. I'm in the midst of reading for that. They pushed again on the instrumental variables. So we're going through the data now, trying to figure out what else we can capture or proxy that would be reasonable. And they asked us to do a survey to validate. So let's say we keep those 4. The plan would be to show actual tweets to users and ask them to the extent to which these things are represented in those tweets, and then see if our ways of capturing them through our own natural language processing or the various methods we used are actually validated by consumers' attitudes. So we'll be launching a survey. We're starting the IRB process for that. And again, pushing us on, how is this different? So one of the examples would be, they say, well, even though you say you're looking at the entire conversation, you're looking at these 3 pieces at the time. And so our argument is that we really are looking at that average across the whole conversation at any point. But we might end up just dropping that from our claims in order to satisfy the reviewers and not be seen as trying to oversell our contribution. So again, this is very fresh. So just starting to work on this. It's due in 6 months. Well, I guess we have 5. So with that, I will pause and we can go to any area of this you'd like to talk about. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
So before we open the stage for the questions, I have, one, I'm curious to know about your second, the slide before this, where you have talked about the elements of empathetic engagement and active listening. And if I remember in your round 1 revision, it was more in the speech act theory. And, they were talking about the multiple items were there. So is that the reviewers are asking more at a higher order construct to be built, and all the elements which you are putting like as in topic or sensitivity of to learn to listen to the the sentiments. So all the 4 things which you have, right? Those 4 things should be like at the sentiment, topic, age, agent signing, and direct messaging, and the empathetic wording. All of this comes under that engagement, the empathetic engagement theory. Is that the idea, or is it something else which?
So to your question about, are they asking us? So I mean, in terms of mechanics, they're not asking us to create kind of in a structural equation modeling type way, a higher order concept where these are kind of lower level concepts. They haven't asked us to do that specifically, but what they've said is, different reviewers kind of picked on, I'm going to use that language. I don't mean to disrespect the reviewers. I think we all do this when we review. If anything just simply isn't clear to us, we tend to call it out. And so that's what's happened. So different reviewers picked on different variables. So it's not like the entire review team said in unison the same exact thing. So like 2 of the reviewers really pushed back on the idea of direct messaging being reflective of empathy, because they saw it as sort of a selfish thing by the firm to hide. And I mean, I understand the criticism. I don't agree that in all cases that's what's happening. I mean, frankly, in this case, a user can't really help, a firm can't really help a user without taking the conversation offline and getting more information. So it might be that it's just a problematic variable that we end up taking out. So in terms of the overall, active listening was just a label that the editor-in-chief told us to use so that we would not be directly comparing our findings, our paper to, or readers won't be directly comparing to these recent papers on empathy. So framing active listening as an approach to these interactions, as opposed to a higher order concept. So we'll think of it as these elements are like pillars of active listening, where to actively listen, you have to, 1, understand the topic they're talking about, 2, understand that they're upset or not, match their sentiment. So these are like pillars, as opposed to say underlying concepts that roll up to a higher order one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is. However, as an author, do you feel that this whole thing can be built on an overarching theory basis on like active listening or something? I don't know. This is for JMR, so I'm not very sure whether it is really needed or not. Binding all of these things with some overarching theory, do you think that's an idea? Like,
I think that they ideally want us to try to do that, to sort of wrap. So by the way, we do not formally hypothesize relationships in the paper. And at least one of the reviewers has pushed us to do so. The editor has not told us we need to do so. So we use this as kind of in that empirics first approach that there's a wonderful editorial in JM by the previous editorial team, Harold and Paige and Chris and Rob, where they talk about, actually, I'm not sure all four of them are on that, but Harold is one of the authors on that editorial. And in that editorial, they talk about the role of empirics first in our research, including top journals, because this is simply a phenomenon that is out there. It's of extreme importance to firms now who really must interact with consumers in social media, and especially customer service. Now, you often, for many companies, don't even have phone numbers you can call anymore. They simply use social media. You go tweet to the firm and say you've had a problem, and then they reach out to you. So we don't agree that if a paper, if a project, if a study is motivated by an observed real world phenomenon, that trying to fit it under one theory is necessary. We don't believe that, but I think it's about how to frame the expectations we have for these various variables, right? So it's more packaging, I believe. And if we can't explain why we think something is important and going to have an effect, then they're finding fault with that. And I don't disagree with that. I think that's actually a very valid point. So we have not done a good enough job convincing them why these things matter, right? So I think overarching theory is probably a stretch for this paper. It'll be about how we frame these things, these elements of firm-generated content in a way that makes sense to the reviewers and doesn't feel like it's just a purely data-driven exercise that they respond negatively to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and given that now we have so many phenomena and the dimensions coming in, especially in the customer centric strategies which the firms are coming with, and moreover with the social media thing and the new age technologies coming in, I don't know how far as a researcher we can really justify providing the overarching theory for every framework and every model in the data and the kind of model building you want to come up with, whether we write the conceptual pieces or the empirical pieces. This theory building and binding it with the theory with the new age things coming in is a challenge.
I agree. Yeah. Maybe we'll see some new theory development, because I think that they're just simply phenomena that have not happened in the past. And so, pre-existing theory is not always going to be able to explain it. So yeah, I agree with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Kelly, for the wonderful presentation. We keep the floor open for the questions now. I invite questions from the audience. You can unmute yourself and talk your own question if at all you are not putting it on the chat box. And Kelly, we have with us Professor Huda Khan with us. You know her, right? She is one of the guest editor of the special issue at Jim.
Yes,
she's joining us.
We've at least corresponded. So yeah, it's very nice to have you here.
My dear Professor Kelly, how are you?
I'm wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. I will not ask any question about the presentation itself, but I think we should not leave this opportunity to ask you a question about what are the future areas of research that we should consider, and what are the hot topics these days in that journals are really liking. I think that will really be very helpful for all of us.
Maybe
Sure.
we can talk more about the GIM, Journal of International Marketing.
Particularly about Journal of International Marketing.
No, great question. And thank you for allowing me to talk about the Journal of International Marketing, one of my favorite topics. And actually, I just gave a webinar with David Griffith, the area editor for marketing under JIBS, and John Cadogan, the current editor-in-chief of IMR, International Marketing Review. And I really talked about exactly that, how to come up with impactful ideas and what are some impactful ideas. And some of the advice that I gave during that webinar was to look around at world events. I mean, in a global arena, there is a lot going on. We have disruption in terms of wars. I mean, the actual conflicts across countries. We have wars in terms of trade, like the U.S.-China trade war, which happened under our previous government administration. We also have major disruptions in terms of, and other types of trade disruptions, where, like Brexit, for example, where we have major changes in trade agreements across countries. The digital transformation and infrastructure differences across countries. So what I advise to people is to look at some of these significant disruptions that are occurring around the world, and in even, for example, the global pandemic. So these major disruptions impact every corner of the globe, and in my mind, set up a tremendous opportunity for us to think about how either marketers contribute. So in terms of environmental change and climate change, for example, what is the role of marketers in terms of contributing to that problem by trying to encourage overconsumption and waste, for example, or what is marketing's role in terms of responding to these disruptions? I think there's so many interesting things we can look at. So is, for example, marketing role to help attenuate some of the negative impacts of things like waste or consumption of treatments for the pandemic and things of this nature that we simply didn't have the opportunity to study in the past. I think looking at these world events and thinking about the marketer's role in either, contributing, responding, et cetera, provides a tremendous opportunity and would be of interest to, I think, the international marketing community and for JIM. And I would love to see us tackle big real world issues in our research. I think, thinking about these microscopically and arguing over one variable might move a paper forward, but I also think that thinking about these big issues has the potential to really change behavior and to contribute to our knowledge about how to make things better. So I'll encourage you to think that way. I hope that helped.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Adding to this, Kelly, your reflection, some of your thoughts on this new age technology, such as like artificial intelligence and the occurrence of ChatGPT kind of sources, right? So do you think that it's gonna have any impact on the international marketing domain, or it will, and you would be interested as an editor to see some of these impacts coming on the international business side?
Sure. Well, absolutely. I think they'll have an impact, and I would even frame them as a form of disruption, right? We're seeing now how, we all are having to think very quickly on how we're going to react to these. So I look at the range of impact on international marketing of these new technologies, from everything from consumer purchase experience. I think about digital payments. I think about the metaverse and how we're going to access goods and services in this new environment, potentially. I think about those kinds of issues. But for ChatGPT, I think the verdict is not in yet on what type of impact it's going to have. I mean, how are we going to stay ahead of, it doesn't do a good job of, I've seen people try to say, write a paper on this. And what it does is it spits out interesting text, but garbage and references. So I think it's a long way from being a threat to us as publishers and as editors. I don't think that's going to be a risk that we deal with anytime soon, unless it gets way more sophisticated. But I do think that there's opportunity for us to look at them as tools. So, for example, can ChatGPT help us with something like, I don't know, creating a lit review table or something like that, where it could be useful to us if we can figure out how to harness its power. And that might be a way to see a positive impact. So I don't know, those are my initial thoughts. I'm not sure if that answered your question directly, but yeah.
No, thank you so much, Kelly. We have a question for the talk which you have presented, that the kind of tools you have used for the analysis of this data.
So depending on the piece of the data, let me go to the table I skipped. Here we go. So this, I think, is the most useful way to answer that question. And I'm happy to provide these slides, Shapali, if you would like to make them available to people. This is a paper that's in the review process. So
that would be too kind of you.
Our names are all over it. So it's not like I need to hide it from anybody. So for example, sentiment, we use Vader. It's not listed here. I was thinking it was Vader, V-A-D-E-R. This is Mike and Bill's expertise. So Mike, again, my former doctoral student who's at the University of Missouri, this is his wheelhouse. He's incredibly gifted at textual analysis. And so sentiment, again, for preceding is the average of this score from Vader on this 0 to 100 for sentiment. And then the same for FGC sentiment. Empathetic wording, we used a dictionary from this Herrhausen et al. Paper. And it was just the fraction of words in the tweet that are in that dictionary. That's what that is. And then for topics, we used LDA or latent derelict analysis. And we, again, came up in the second round after we pulled all those other tweets in, we had to rerun the topic modeling. And it was, I think, around 10 topics that we came out with. And then to do the topic matching, it was the average cosine similarity between the topics being discussed in the prior and subsequent the tweets by the firm. And then direct messaging and agent signing were simply, is there a direct message on the tweet? Is there a signature on the tweet? So all of that was done by Mike, just independently on every variable. And I believe he used a combination of Python and R, if the software package is part of that question. So I hope that helps. If it didn't answer your question, please clarify or let me know what else I can provide that would be helpful.
So Gaurav asked this question. Gaurav, is this, I hope this is helpful to you. And if you have any more questions to it, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Perfectly helpful. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Any more questions from the audience? All right. Great. So Kelly, maybe you can pull down the slides for a while so that we see you can stop share. Yeah, thank you so much. All right, so thank you so much, Kelly, for being here with us. And of course, like sharing your research at this stage where it is in the second round of revision at the top tier journal like JMR is quite insightful for all the PhD students who are there, and they can really see the rigor and the kind of relevance which is important to reach to the top tier journals so that they entertain you and they can, you get into the, the rounds of revision. Of course, no paper can spare themselves like with the multiple rounds of revision. So getting a revision is a good news for everyone, right? So thank you so much for sharing this insightful work with us. We are really indeed grateful for that. And Kelly, you being a support for us in the center, we always appreciate your presence to MICA, whether it is virtually or whether it is in person. We are very much looking forward to have in person too.